The Omnipotence Paradox. You're standing on the edge of a vast philosophical canyon, staring into the depths of a question that has baffled theologians, philosophers, and thinkers for centuries. The air feels charged with possibility and contradiction, and your mind races as you hear the question: can an all-powerful being create a rock so heavy that even they cannot lift it? At first, it seems like a straightforward riddle, but the more you think about it, the more tangled the logic becomes. You realize this isn't just a simple question about strength or creation. It's a trap door into a debate about the very nature of power, logic, and existence. To truly grasp the weight of this paradox, you need to step into the shoes of the omnipotent being. Imagine having infinite power, the ability to do anything, create anything, and overcome any obstacle. It feels limitless, doesn't it? But then the question sneaks up on you. If you can do anything, can you create something so powerful, so immovable, that even you cannot overcome it? Suddenly, the concept of omnipotence collapses in on itself. If you can create the rock, then you're not powerful enough to lift it. But if you can't create it, then you're not truly omnipotent in the first place. This is where the paradox tightens its grip. Omnipotence, at first glance, seems straightforward, the ability to do anything. Yet when pushed to its logical extremes, the very definition begins to unravel. If omnipotence is unlimited power, does it include the power to limit itself? And if it does that self-imposed limitation destroy the very idea of being all-powerful? The question starts to feel less like a riddle and more like a test of the limits of language and logic itself. But let's go deeper. The omnipotence paradox isn't just about rocks or lifting, it's about the boundaries of possibility. It forces you to ask, is omnipotence subject to logic, or does it transcend it? If it's bound by logic, then there are things even an omnipotent being cannot do, like creating a square circle or making 2 + 2 = 5. But if omnipotence isn't bound by logic, then the concept becomes incoherent. How can we even discuss something that defies the basic rules of thought? This paradox has far-reaching implications. It challenges not just the concept of divine power, but also the way you think about reality itself. Consider this: if omnipotence requires adhering to logical consistency, then the universe is governed by laws even a deity must follow. In that case, power isn't absolute. It's constrained by the framework of reason. But if omnipotence breaks free of these constraints, then how can you or anyone else understand it? It becomes unknowable, an enigma that resists definition. For centuries, philosophers have wrestled with this dilemma. Some argue that omnipotence doesn't mean the ability to do the logically impossible. They suggest that statements like creating a rock so heavy it can't be lifted are nonsensical, like asking for a colorless color or a soundless sound. These aren't limitations of power, they argue. They're limits of language and human understanding. Others take a different approach, redefining omnipotence as the ability to do anything that's within the realm of possibility. But even this doesn't fully escape the paradox, because it raises another question: who decides what's possible? And then there are those who embrace the paradox, seeing it not as a flaw, but as a reflection of the mystery and majesty of divine power. They argue that trying to fit omnipotence into the box of human logic is like trying to let the ocean in your hands. The paradox, they say, isn't a problem to be solved, but a reminder of the limits of human understanding. So, where does that leave you? Staring into the same canyon, grappling with a question that has no easy answer. The Omnipotence Paradox isn't just a theological puzzle, it's a mirror reflecting your assumptions about power, logic, and the universe itself. It challenges you to confront the boundaries of what you know, and perhaps to accept that some questions will always remain unanswered. In the end, maybe that's the point. The paradox doesn't weaken the concept of omnipotence. It enriches it, forcing you to acknowledge the vastness of what you cannot comprehend. It's not about solving the riddle. It's about understanding the mystery. And perhaps, just perhaps, the true power lies in embracing the question, not the answer. The abortion paradox. You find yourself caught in the center of a moral storm, a clash of principles so deeply rooted in human values that no side feels like it can yield without betraying its core beliefs. On one hand, the sanctity of life, a principle almost universally revered, demands protection for the unborn, the voiceless, the innocent. On the other, the autonomy of the mother, a cornerstone of personal freedom and dignity, asserts her right to make decisions about her own body. The question hangs in the air like a pendulum swinging between these opposing forces. If life is sacred, how do we balance the rights of the unborn with the rights of the mother? This paradox isn't just a theoretical puzzle. It's an emotional battlefield, one where deeply held convictions collide. Both sides claim the moral high ground, yet each denies the validity of the other's perspective. You feel the weight of this tension as you try to untangle the ethical threads that bind this issue so tightly. To the advocates of the unborn, the argument is clear and unshakable. Life begins at conception, and every life has inherent value. From this view, abortion is not merely a personal choice. It's the taking of a life, a moral failing that contradicts the very principle of human dignity. They argue that society has a duty to protect the most vulnerable among us, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's hard. But turn the lens, and the perspective shifts. To those who defend a woman's right to choose, the focus isn't on the unborn alone. It's on the living, breathing person who must bear the physical, emotional, and social consequences of pregnancy. From this view, forcing a woman to carry an unwanted pregnancy is a violation of her autonomy, her freedom to control her own body. It's a denial of her humanity in favor of an abstract ideal. The paradox sharpens when you realize that both positions are rooted in principles that, in isolation, seem unassailable. Protecting life and honoring autonomy are both ethical imperatives, yet here they clash in a way that feels impossible to reconcile. How do you weigh one against the other? Which value takes precedence, and why? The dilemma forces you to confront the complexity of moral reasoning. Life, as a concept, isn't just biological. It's relational, contextual, and deeply personal. The mother's life isn't merely a backdrop to the unborn's existence. It's the foundation upon which that life depends. At the same time, the unborn's potential, their capacity to become, is undeniable. Balancing these realities is like trying to hold water in your hands. The harder you grip, the more it slips through your fingers. The abortion paradox also challenges the limits of absolute principles. Can any value truly stand alone, unchallenged by circumstance? If life is sacred, does that sanctity extend to the suffering and hardship of a mother forced into a decision she didn't choose? And if autonomy is paramount, is it absolute even when another life is at stake? The questions spiral outward, each answer leading to more uncertainty. History adds another layer of complexity. Across cultures and eras, societies have grappled with the question of when life begins and who has the right to decide. Religious doctrines, legal frameworks, and philosophical debates have all offered answers, yet none have resolved the issue entirely. The paradox persists, reflecting the diverse and often conflicting values that shape human experience. But perhaps the most profound aspect of the abortion paradox is its ability to reveal our shared humanity. Both sides, for all their differences, are rooted in a desire to protect, to nurture, to honor what they see as sacred. They are united in their care for life, even as they disagree on how to express it. This paradox isn't just a divide, it's a mirror, showing us the depth of our convictions and the limits of our understanding. So where does that leave you? Perhaps in a place of humility, recognizing that no answer will ever feel fully complete. The abortion paradox isn't about finding a definitive solution. It's about grappling with the complexity of human values and the tensions they create. It forces you to confront the reality that life, in all its forms, is messy, nuanced, and deeply intertwined. In the end, the paradox doesn't weaken the arguments on either side. It strengthens them, revealing the profound depth of the questions at stake. It reminds you that true moral reasoning isn't about easy answers or simple solutions. It's about staying in the tension, wrestling with the contradictions, and finding a way to honor the humanity on both sides of the divide. And maybe, just maybe, the real lesson is this. Some questions aren't meant to be resolved. They're meant to be understood. The trolley problem. You're standing at a fork in the tracks, gripping a lever that feels heavier than anything you've ever held. In the distance, a runaway trolley barrels toward 5 people tied to the tracks. They're unaware, unable to escape. On the other track, there's just one person, equally helpless. You realize that pulling the lever will divert the trolley, sparing the 5, but killing the 1. The question hits you like a train itself. What do you do? This isn't just a choice, it's a collision between two powerful moral instincts. On one hand, you feel the pull of utilitarianism, the idea that the greatest good for the greatest number is the ultimate moral goal. Saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 seems like the logical choice. But then another voice rises within you, one that clings to moral absolutes. Taking any action that directly causes someone's death feels fundamentally wrong, no matter the outcome. The trolley problem isn't just a thought experiment, it's a mirror reflecting the deepest contradictions in human morality. Would you act to save 5 at the cost of 1, becoming complicit in a deliberate harm? Or would you refuse to act, preserving your moral purity, but allowing more lives to be lost? But the paradox deepens. Imagine you know the one person on the second track, a friend, a sibling, a lover. Suddenly, the equation shifts. It's no longer just a matter of numbers. It's personal, visceral. The abstract logic of utilitarianism begins to falter, replaced by the messy, emotional complexity of human relationships. The trolley problem also forces you to confront the nature of moral responsibility. If you pull the lever, are you responsible for the one death? Or does the blame lie with the situation itself, the runaway trolley, the cruel twist of fate? And if you do nothing, are you complicit in the deaths of the 5, or merely a bystander swept up in forces beyond your control? This paradox isn't confined to the realm of philosophy classrooms. It echoes in real-world dilemmas every day. Consider a doctor allocating limited resources. Do they save 1 patient with a slim chance of survival, or focus on 5 others who are more likely to recover? Or a policymaker deciding whether to sacrifice a small community to save an entire city from a natural disaster. The trolley problem is everywhere, lurking in the hard decisions that define lives and shape societies. Yet, as you wrestle with the question, another layer emerges. Is it fair to reduce life to numbers and outcomes? 5 lives versus 1? It seems straightforward, but life is never so simple. The people on the tracks aren't just statistics. They're individuals with stories, relationships, and futures. Who are we to play God, weighing their worth against one another? For centuries, philosophers have debated the trolley problem, not to solve it, but to expose the hidden tensions in ethical reasoning. Utilitarians argue that pulling the lever is a moral obligation, prioritizing the collective good over individual harm. Deontologists, on the other hand, insist that certain actions, like deliberately causing harm, are inherently wrong, regardless of the outcome. Both positions feel compelling, yet they tear at each other in ways that defy easy resolution. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is that the trolley problem reveals the limits of human morality. We crave clear rules, definitive answers, and moral certainty, but the world rarely offers them. Instead, we are left with imperfect choices, each carrying its own burden of guilt and regret. And then there's the unsettling possibility that no matter what choice you make, the paradox wins. If you pull the lever, you're haunted by the life you sacrificed. If you don't, you're haunted by the lives you allowed to be lost. The trolley problem isn't just a dilemma. It's a reminder that morality is often a gray, uncertain space where every choice comes with a cost. So what can you do? Perhaps the lesson of the trolley problem isn't about making the right decision, but about acknowledging the weight of moral responsibility. It's about recognizing that some questions don't have clean answers, only trade-offs and consequences. And maybe the greatest moral act isn't solving the problem, but wrestling with it honestly, refusing to look away from the uncomfortable truths it reveals. In the end, the trolley problem doesn't let you off the hook. It forces you to step into the paradox, to face the complexity of human morality head on. It asks not just what you would do, but what kind of person you want to be when faced with impossible choices. And that, perhaps, is the most important question of all: the free will versus determinism. Paradox. You're standing at a crossroads, not just in life, but in thought. Every decision you've ever made flashes before your eyes. What you've done, who you've become, what you'll do next. You tell yourself you're in control, a captain steering the ship of your own destiny. But then a shadowy question creeps in. What if you're not? What if every choice you've made was never truly yours to begin with, but a result of forces far beyond your control? Are you truly free? Or are you just following a script written by your biology, your upbringing, the universe itself? This is the paradox of free will versus determinism, a riddle as old as human thought. On one side stands the belief in free will, the idea that you are the master of your own fate, able to choose your path without constraint. Is empowering, isn't it? The thought that your actions, your will, are yours alone. On the other side looms determinism, the notion that every decision, every move you make is the inevitable outcome of prior causes, your genetic code, the way you were raised, the events that shaped you. If every effect has a cause, then where does freedom fit into the equation? The paradox hits you hardest when you realize the stakes. Free will isn't just a philosophical concept. It's the foundation of how we live, how we judge, how we define responsibility. If free will is an illusion, what happens to accountability? Can you blame someone for their actions if they were destined to act that way? Can you even take credit for your own successes if they were simply the product of forces you never controlled? Think about it. The choices you've made today, what to eat, what to say, what to think, feel deliberate, intentional, but beneath the surface, your brain is a maze of neurons firing in patterns you didn't choose, shaped by a lifetime of experiences you didn't ask for. Every decision you make might feel free, but what if it's just the next inevitable step in a chain stretching back to the beginning of time? And yet, there's something deeply unsettling about denying free will altogether. If everything is predetermined, then why do you feel this undeniable sense of agency? Why do you feel conflicted, weighing options, grappling with choices? If you're nothing more than a puppet, then who or what is pulling the strings? Philosophers have struggled with this question for centuries. Some argue for compatibilism, the idea that free will and determinism can coexist. They suggest that even if your choices are influenced by external factors, the ability to reflect, deliberate, and act according to your own desires still counts as free will. Others reject this, insisting that true freedom means being the ultimate author of your actions. A standard determinism makes impossible. Science complicates the picture even further. Neuroscientists have shown that decisions can often be predicted milliseconds before you become consciously aware of them. Imagine that. Your brain knows what you're going to do before you do. Does that mean your sense of choice is just a convincing illusion, a story your mind tells itself to make sense of the inevitable? But the paradox doesn't stop there. If we embrace determinism fully, does it strip life of meaning? Without free will, are love, creativity, and morality reduced to nothing more than biochemical reactions and conditioned responses? The thought feels cold, mechanical, a world devoid of the magic of human experience. At the same time, rejecting determinism can feel naive. How can you ignore the overwhelming influence of genetics, culture, and circumstance on every aspect of life? The paradox grips you tightly, pulling you between these two worlds, freedom and inevitability, without offering an escape. And yet, maybe the real power of this paradox isn't in solving it, but in sitting with its tension. It forces you to confront the complexity of human existence, to question the stories you tell yourself about who you are and why you do what you do. It reminds you that life is messy, a tangled web of choices and constraints, freedom and fate. So, where does that leave you? Maybe the answer lies not in choosing one side, but in embracing both. You are shaped by forces beyond your control, yes, but you are also a thinking, feeling being who can reflect on those forces, challenge them, and carve meaning from them. The paradox doesn't weaken your humanity, it deepens it, reminding you that even in uncertainty, you have the power to ask, to wonder, to strive. And perhaps, in the end, that's what makes you free. Not the absence of constraints, but the ability to grapple with them, to find purpose within the paradox, and to keep asking the question, even when the answer remains just out of reach. The moral luck paradox. You stand in judgment, weighing someone's actions on the scales of morality. A reckless driver swerves down a busy street, tires screeching. In one version of events, they narrowly miss a pedestrian. In another, they don't. The outcome is different. One ends in relief, the other in tragedy, but the action is the same. And yet, your judgment wavers. The driver who killed someone feels far more culpable than the one who didn't. The question rises like an unrelenting tide. How can you judge morality when so much depends on luck? This is the moral luck paradox, a dilemma that pulls apart the foundations of justice and fairness. At its core is a troubling inconsistency. You want to believe people are judged by their intentions and choices, but outcomes, often shaped by chance, inevitably influence your moral assessments. Imagine two surgeons performing the same risky operation. Both take every precaution, both make every effort to save their patients. But in one case, the patient survives. In the other, they don't. Is one surgeon more moral than the other? Or are they both equally blameless or praiseworthy, despite the different results? The paradox sharpens when you realize just how much of morality hinges on luck. Consider the driver again. If the pedestrian wasn't in the crosswalk that day, the reckless act would have gone unnoticed, unpunished, even forgotten. But if they were, the driver becomes a criminal, defined by a single tragic outcome. The randomness of life, the weather timing, the actions of others plays a role in shaping moral judgments. Yet these factors lie far beyond anyone's control. This paradox forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about morality itself. Is it fair to judge someone for things they couldn't predict or prevent? Or does fairness require stripping away all external factors, focusing only on intent? But then, where does that leave the victim, the consequences, the real-world impact of these actions? Philosophers have wrestled with this question for centuries, trying to make sense of how luck intersects with morality. Some argue that outcomes must play a role in moral judgment because they shape the world in tangible ways. A good intention may be admirable, but if it leads to harm, can it truly be considered moral? Others insist that morality is about what you can control, your intentions, your choices, your effort. To hold someone accountable for circumstances they couldn't influence feels unjust, even cruel. But the moral luck paradox doesn't stop there. It splits into different kinds of luck, each adding new layers of complexity. There's circumstantial luck, where the situation you're born into shapes your opportunities and challenges. Would you make the same moral choices if you grew up in poverty or privilege or in a war zone? Then there's resultant luck, where the consequences of your actions define how you're judged. And finally, constitutive luck, the role of the genetic and psychological dice that makes you who you are, influencing your character, your impulses, your strengths, and flaws. The more you think about it, the harder it becomes to separate morality from luck. Even your ability to act morally can depend on things you didn't choose: your upbringing, your temperament, the resources available to you. Can anyone claim full credit for their virtues or take sole blame for their flaws? The paradox presses you further, challenging your notions of justice. Legal systems often try to distinguish between intent and outcome, punishing recklessness and negligence differently from accidents or deliberate harm. But even here, outcomes matter. Manslaughter is judged more harshly than a near miss, even if the driver's intent was identical. Is this fair, or is it a concession to human emotions, our instinctive need to see harm balanced by punishment? Yet, within this paradox lies a deeper lesson about compassion. If luck shapes so much of who we are and what we do, then judgment alone feels insufficient. The moral luck paradox invites you to move beyond blame, to recognize the shared fragility of human experience. It reminds you that morality isn't just about outcomes or intentions. It's about understanding the forces that drive us, the circumstances that shape us, and the ways we navigate a world we can't fully control. So where does this leave you? Perhaps with a softer heart, a clearer view of the complexity of human behavior. The moral luck paradox doesn't provide easy answers, but it asks you to look deeper, to question your assumptions about fairness, and to approach judgment with humility. It challenges you to see beyond the surface of actions, to the intricate web of factors that shape them. In the end, the paradox doesn't weaken morality, it deepens it. It forces you to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that life is messy, unpredictable, and often unfair. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest moral act isn't in casting judgment, but in recognizing the luck that connects us all and choosing compassion over certainty. The problem of evil. You sit with the question, heavy as a stone in your chest, one that echoes through time and across every human experience. If there is a God, a being both all-powerful and infinitely good, why is there so much pain in the world? Why do innocent children suffer? Why do wars rage? And why does death come too soon for some and not soon enough for others? You try to reconcile the existence of a benevolent creator with the unrelenting reality of suffering, and the contradiction cuts deeper the more you think about it. This is the problem of evil, one of the oldest and most troubling paradoxes of human thought. It challenges not just faith, but the very idea of justice, fairness, and the meaning of existence. If God is all-powerful, surely God has the ability to prevent suffering. If God is all good, surely God would want to. And yet suffering persists, relentless, indiscriminate, and often incomprehensible. You look for answers, but they all seem to slip through your fingers. Some argue that suffering exists because of free will, that God gave humans the freedom to choose, even if that freedom leads to evil. But does this explanation satisfy you? Think of the child born into war or disease. What choice did they have? Why should their suffering be the price of someone else's freedom? Others say that suffering has a purpose, that it's a test, a lesson, a path to growth. Pain, they argue, refines the soul, shaping strength, compassion, and resilience. But even as you nod to this idea, it falters when faced with senseless tragedy. How do you explain the suffering of the innocent, the devastation of natural disasters, the cruelty that seems to have no purpose? What lesson could justify such loss? The paradox deepens when you consider the omnipotence of God. If God is all-powerful, then couldn't God create a world where free will exists without suffering? A world where lessons don't require pain? The tension between divine power and the reality of evil feels insurmountable, as if the very foundations of faith are trembling. Philosophers and theologians have wrestled with this problem for centuries, splitting into camps that offer vastly different answers. Some argue that evil is an illusion, a byproduct of human perception. From a divine perspective, they say, what we see as evil is simply part of a greater plan, one we're too limited to understand. But does that comfort you? When you stand at the graveside of someone you love, does it ease the ache to think their death is part of the plan? Others propose that God is not omnipotent in the way we imagine. They suggest that divine power is limited by the nature of the universe or by the very existence of free will. God, they argue, works within constraints, not as a cosmic puppeteer, but as a guiding presence. This vision of God may feel more relatable, even more compassionate, but it also raises questions. Can a being with limits truly be called God? And then there are those who take the problem of evil as evidence that God does not exist at all. To them, the paradox is not a question to solve, but a proof that the idea of a benevolent, omnipotent deity is incompatible with reality. For many, this conclusion feels like the only honest answer to the problem, but it also leaves a void, stripping away the comfort and meaning that faith provides. Yet, even as the problem of evil challenges belief, it also highlights something profound about the human condition. You care about suffering. You're outraged by it, moved by it, driven to question and seek answers because of it. This paradox forces you to confront the depths of your empathy, your sense of justice, and your desire for a world that makes sense. Perhaps that's where the paradox leads, not to answers, but to action. If the existence of evil troubles you, what can you do about it? If the world feels unfair, how can you work to bring fairness to it? The problem of evil doesn't just challenge faith, it challenges you. In the end, the paradox of evil remains unresolved, a question that defies logic and easy explanation. But maybe that's its purpose, to remind you of the mystery of existence, the fragility of life, and the power of your response to suffering. It asks not only why the world is as it is, but how you will live within it. And perhaps the truest answer lies not in solving the paradox, but in the choices you make in its shadow, to comfort the grieving, to stand against injustice, to ease suffering where you can. For in those acts, however small, you may find a glimpse of the divine, not as an all-powerful force, but as the spark of compassion that refuses to be extinguished. The Euthanasia Paradox. You're sitting at the bedside of someone you love, watching them suffer. Every labored breath, every flicker of pain on their face feels like a knife twisting in your chest. They whisper through tears and exhaustion that they're ready to let go, that the fight has become too much, and you're faced with a question that cuts to the heart of morality and humanity. Is it right to grant their wish, to end their suffering, even if it means ending their life? Or is the act of taking life, even mercifully, a line that must never be crossed? This is the Euthanasia Paradox, where compassion and morality collide in a profound and painful way. On one side, there's the undeniable urge to alleviate suffering, to let someone die peacefully, with dignity, feels like an act of love. But on the other, there's the weight of taking life, the fear that, even with the best intentions, crossing that boundary violates something sacred. The paradox isn't abstract, it's painfully real. Families, patients, and doctors face this dilemma every day, torn between the desire to end unbearable pain and the instinct to preserve life at all costs. You might ask yourself, is prolonging life always the right choice if that life is defined by suffering? Or does allowing death as a release open a door we're not meant to walk through? Supporters of euthanasia argue that it's the ultimate act of compassion, a way to honor someone's autonomy and spare them unnecessary torment. If someone is suffering with no hope of recovery, why should they be forced to endure it? Isn't it more humane to allow them to choose their own end on their own terms? But then the counter-argument rises like a shadow. Taking life, even with consent, feels like a betrayal of the principle that life is inherently valuable. Some ask, what if the decision is made too hastily, clouded by despair? What if the pain, while unbearable now, could be eased with better care? And what does it mean for society if the line between preserving life and ending it becomes blurred? The paradox sharpens when you consider autonomy. On the surface, it seems clear. A person should have the right to decide when and how they die. But how free is that choice when it's shaped by suffering, fear, or feelings of being a burden? Is the wish to die truly autonomous if it's driven by despair or the inadequacies of the healthcare system? Then there's the role of the doctor, trained to heal, not to harm. Euthanasia challenges the very heart of medical ethics. Do no harm. But is it more harmful to prolong pain than to end it? Doctors who participate in euthanasia often describe it as the hardest yet most compassionate act they've ever performed. Still, it leaves them carrying a burden, moral, emotional, even legal. The Euthanasia Paradox also forces you to confront the nature of dignity. For some, dignity means being able to make choices about their own body and fate, even in death. For others, it means valuing life enough to endure suffering, no matter how unbearable. Both perspectives feel deeply human, yet irreconcilable. Philosophers and ethicists have debated this paradox for centuries. Some argue from a utilitarian perspective, weighing the reduction of suffering against the moral cost of ending life. Others take a deontological stance, insisting that certain acts, like taking life, are inherently wrong, regardless of the consequences. And then there are those who see euthanasia as a deeply personal issue, one that transcends universal principles and depends entirely on the individual and their circumstances. This paradox also reflects broader societal tensions. In countries where euthanasia is legal, strict safeguards are meant to ensure it's used only as a last resort. But even then, debates rage about slippery slopes, the potential for abuse, and what it means for how we value life. Where do you draw the line between compassion and control? And yet, at the heart of this paradox lies a truth that's both beautiful and tragic. It's about love, the desire to ease someone's suffering, to honor their wishes, and to let them go when holding on feels cruel. It all comes from a place of love. But love also makes the decision unbearable, filling you with doubt, guilt, and the weight of what could have been. So where does that leave you? Perhaps the euthanasia paradox isn't about finding a definitive answer, but about sitting with the complexity of life, death, and the choices in between. It challenges you to weigh compassion against morality, autonomy against caution, and to recognize that no decision will ever feel completely right. In the end, the paradox forces you to grapple with what it means to be human, to suffer, to love, to hope, and to face the inevitability of loss. And maybe the lesson isn't in resolving the question, but in honoring the humanity of those who wrestle with it, finding grace in the impossible choices, and holding space for the profound, fragile dignity of life and death. The paradox of democracy. You stand in the heart of a bustling square, surrounded by voices. They're loud, passionate, brimming with the power of choice. This is democracy, the great equalizer, where every voice matters, every vote counts. But as you look closer, cracks begin to show. The very system designed to ensure freedom and equality carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. Democracy can give rise to tyranny, not through coups or dictatorships, but through the will of the majority. The question strikes like a lightning bolt. Can true freedom coexist with the power of the mob. This is the paradox of democracy, where the ideals of liberty and equality collide with the reality of human behavior. At its core is a contradiction that feels impossible to resolve. Democracy promises freedom, but it can also take it away. A majority, empowered by the system, can suppress minorities, erode rights, and even dismantle the very foundations of democracy itself. Think about it. In a perfect democracy, the majority rules. But what happens when the majority uses its power to silence dissent, to marginalize those who don't align with its views? History offers countless examples. Leaders elected through democratic processes who then undermine institutions, erode freedoms, and consolidate power. From ancient Athens to modern regimes, democracy has often opened the door to authoritarianism, not as an external threat, but as something born from within. The paradox sharpens when you consider the promise of equality. Democracy gives everyone an equal voice, but does it truly level the playing field? Wealth, privilege, and access to information often tilt the scales, making some voices louder than others. The result is a system where power may technically reside with the people, but in practice, it often favors the few who can manipulate the many. And then there's the question of wisdom. Democracy assumes that people will make rational, informed choices. But are we always rational? The reality is that emotions, biases, and misinformation often guide decisions. Fear can drive people to vote for leaders who promise security at the cost of liberty. Anger can fuel policies that punish rather than protect. And apathy, perhaps the greatest threat of all, can leave critical decisions in the hands of a motivated minority, while the rest remain silent. Philosophers have wrestled with this paradox for centuries. Plato, for example, was deeply skeptical of democracy, fearing it would devolve into mob rule, where unqualified leaders rose to power by appealing to base instincts rather than reason. Tocqueville, while admiring democracy's potential, warned of the tyranny of the majority, where the collective will could oppress individuals and minorities. These critiques feel as relevant today as they did in their time, a reminder that democracy's flaws are as enduring as its ideals. The paradox also raises questions about freedom itself. What does it mean to be free in a democracy? Is it the ability to vote, to speak your mind, to pursue your own life without interference? And what happens when the collective will infringes on that freedom, when the majority decides what you can say, believe, or do? Can freedom exist in a system where the majority has the power to define its limits? Modern democracies grapple with these questions every day. Safeguards like constitutions, independent courts, and human rights laws are meant to protect against the excesses of majority rule. But even these safeguards are not immune to the pressures of populism, corruption, and erosion from within. And yet, despite its flaws, democracy endures. Why? Perhaps because it reflects the messy, imperfect nature of humanity itself. It's not a system of perfection, but of compromise, of balancing competing interests and values. It's a recognition that while no system is flawless, democracy at least offers the possibility of correction, of growth, of evolving towards something better. So, where does that leave you? Standing in a square, surrounded by voices, some wise, some misguided, some angry, some hopeful. The paradox of democracy doesn't offer easy answers, but it challenges you to engage with the system, to recognize its flaws while striving to make it better. It reminds you that democracy is not a static promise, but a living, breathing process, one that requires vigilance, participation, and a willingness to confront its contradictions. In the end, democracy's paradox is its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. It reflects the best and worst of humanity, the potential for both progress and destruction. And perhaps the true power of democracy lies not in its promise of perfection, but in its resilience, the ability to hold space for disagreement, to confront its own failures, and to keep striving for a freedom that includes everyone, even when the path is anything but clear. The paradox of tolerance. You're standing in a bustling square, a place alive with diversity, where ideas, cultures, and beliefs coexist in what seems like harmony. This is the dream of tolerance, a society where everyone, no matter their differences, is accepted and respected. But then, a voice rises above the crowd, one that preaches hatred, exclusion, and the suppression of others. You pause, grappling with a question that feels impossible to answer. Should a tolerant society tolerate intolerance? This is the paradox of tolerance, a dilemma that strikes at the very heart of what it means to live in a free and open society. On one hand, tolerance demands that all viewpoints be heard, even those you find deeply offensive. To silence them would betray the very principle of openness that defines tolerance itself. But on the other hand, allowing hate to flourish risks destroying the foundation of tolerance. As intolerance grows unchecked and begins to erode the freedoms it claims to protect, the tension is immediate and visceral. You want to defend the right to free expression, to uphold the idea that even the most distasteful beliefs have a place in the marketplace of ideas. But then you see the consequences, how unchecked intolerance can spread like wildfire, emboldening those who seek to oppress, marginalize, and destroy. Suddenly, the principle of tolerance feels fragile, a precarious balance teetering on the edge of collapse. Philosopher Karl Popper brought this paradox to light in his 1945 work, The Open Society and Its Enemies. He argued that unlimited tolerance leads to the destruction of tolerance itself. If a society allows intolerant ideologies to take root and grow, they will eventually overpower and suppress the very freedoms that allowed them to exist. To preserve tolerance, Popper insisted, a society must sometimes be intolerant of intolerance. But this solution raises its own set of questions. Where do you draw the line? Not all forms of intolerance are equally dangerous. Disagreeing with someone's politics or values isn't the same as advocating for their suppression or harm. Who decides what crosses the line between healthy conflict and harmful intolerance? And can a society that silences certain viewpoints still call itself truly tolerant? This paradox becomes even more complex when you consider human behavior. Intolerance often arises from fear, ignorance, or a sense of threat. Addressing these root causes through education, dialogue, and empathy might seem like a better solution than outright rejection. But how do you reason with those who refuse to listen, whose entire ideology is built on silencing others? History is filled with examples of the paradox playing out in real time. Democracies have risen and fallen based on how they've handled the tension between tolerance and intolerance. In Weimar Germany, for instance, the tolerance of radical ideologies allowed the rise of the Nazi Party, which ultimately dismantled the democratic system that had tolerated its existence. On the other hand, overly aggressive suppression of dissent can backfire, fueling resentment and driving intolerant ideologies underground, where they fester and grow. In today's world, the paradox of tolerance feels more urgent than ever. Social media amplifies voices, both tolerant and intolerant, on a scale previously unimaginable. Debates over free speech, hate speech, and censorship rage daily, with no clear consensus on how to navigate this delicate balance. Should platforms silence those who spread hate, or does doing so violate the principles of free expression? And then there's the emotional toll. Tolerance asks a lot of you: to listen, to empathize, to accept differences even when they challenge your deepest beliefs. But where does tolerance end and self-preservation begin? At what point does standing firm in defense of openness mean rejecting those who seek to close it off? The paradox forces you to confront a difficult truth. Tolerance is not easy. It's not passive acceptance or blind neutrality. It's an active, often messy process of navigating the gray areas between freedom and safety, inclusion and exclusion. So, where does that leave you? Perhaps with a deeper understanding of what tolerance truly demands. It's not about accepting everything uncritically or turning a blind eye to harm. It's about holding firm to the values that make tolerance possible: freedom, respect, and fairness, while recognizing that these values sometimes require difficult choices. In the end, the paradox of tolerance isn't just a problem to be solved. It's a reflection of the complexities of living in a diverse and open society. It challenges you to think critically about the boundaries of acceptance, to question your own assumptions about fairness, and to confront the uncomfortable reality that tolerance, like freedom, comes with responsibilities. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the paradox is this: tolerance is not about perfection. It's about vigilance. It's about standing up for the principles of openness and inclusion while being willing to confront those who would tear them down. And maybe, just maybe, the act of navigating this paradox, with all its contradictions and challenges, is the truest expression of what it means to live in a tolerant society. The double-edged sword of technology paradox. You hold a sleek device in your hand, a portal to the world, a marvel of human ingenuity. With a single tap, you can connect to loved ones across the globe, access the sum of human knowledge, or summon a car to your doorstep. It feels like magic, the pinnacle of progress. But then you notice the weight of it, the endless notifications, the time slipping away as you scroll, the gnawing sense that you're not in control. The question looms: does technology truly improve life? Or does it trap us in ways we never anticipated? This is the paradox of technology, a double-edged sword that cuts through the fabric of human existence. On one side, it promises to solve problems, to make life easier, safer, and more connected. On the other, it creates new challenges, dependencies, and dilemmas that often feel just as overwhelming as the ones it was meant to fix. Consider the smartphone. It's a miracle of design and function, capable of doing in seconds what once took days. It keeps you informed, entertained, and in touch. But it also keeps you tethered, constantly distracted, and endlessly comparing yourself to carefully curated versions of other people's lives. The same device that empowers you also drains your attention, leaving you wondering whether you control it or it controls you. The paradox isn't new. From the moment humans first shaped tools, innovation has walked this fine line. Fire-cooked food and warmed homes, but also burned cities to the ground. The printing press spread knowledge, but also propaganda and hate. The Industrial Revolution brought unprecedented prosperity, but at the cost of dehumanizing labor and environmental destruction. Each leap forward solves one problem, only to create another, often more complex than the first. Technology's double-edged nature becomes clearer when you think about the pace of innovation. We create faster than we reflect. Social media connects billions, but no one foresaw the psychological toll of constant comparison or the spread of misinformation that undermines democracy. Artificial intelligence promises to revolutionize industries, but raises fears about job displacement, surveillance, and a future where machines outthink their creators. And yet, we keep innovating. Why? Perhaps because technology speaks to our deepest instincts, the drive to explore, to improve, to overcome limits. It's hard to resist the allure of progress, the idea that the next invention will finally solve the problems of the present. But the paradox whispers a warning. What if every solution brings a new set of chains? Think about convenience. Technology simplifies tasks, freeing up time and energy. But what do we do with that freedom? Often, it's filled with more tasks, more consumption, more distractions. The very tools meant to liberate us can end up enslaving us, trapping us in cycles of dependency and diminishing returns. Then there's the question of access. Technology promises equality, but does it deliver? For every innovation that levels the playing field, there are others that widen the gap between those who have and those who don't. The digital divide is real, leaving billions disconnected in a world increasingly built around connection. Even when technology is accessible, it often comes with hidden costs: privacy breaches, exploitation of labor, and environmental degradation. The paradox also forces you to confront your own choices. How often do you trade long-term well-being for short-term convenience? How many times have you reached for your phone to escape boredom, only to feel more restless afterward? Technology isn't just a tool, it's a mirror reflecting the contradictions within you, the human tendency to seek both control and escape, connection and solitude. Philosophers, scientists, and ethicists have long grappled with this paradox. Some argue that the solution lies in restraint, using technology intentionally, balancing progress with reflection. Others suggest that innovation itself must evolve, guided by ethics and sustainability rather than profit and speed. But even these solutions feel incomplete, as if the very act of solving one problem only reveals another. So, where does that leave you? Perhaps it's not about rejecting technology, but redefining your relationship with it. The paradox of technology isn't just about gadgets and systems. It's about humanity's eternal struggle to balance power with responsibility, progress with wisdom. In the end, technology is neither savior nor villain. It's a tool shaped by the intentions and values of those who wield it. The paradox reminds you that every breakthrough carries a burden, every advancement a cost. But it also invites you to look closer, to question whether you're using technology or whether it's using you. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest innovation isn't the next device or app, but the ability to pause, reflect, and choose how you engage with the tools you've created. The paradox doesn't weaken technology's potential. It deepens it, revealing that the real power lies not in what we invent, but in how we choose to live with it. The gender equality paradox. You're standing in a society that has fought long and hard for gender equality. The barriers that once restricted opportunity have been dismantled, or so it seems. Women and men have equal access to education, careers, and leadership. Yet, as you look closer, something feels off. Despite greater freedom, traditional gender roles persist. Women are still overrepresented in caregiving professions, men dominate technical fields, and the divide between what society expects of each gender seems as alive as ever. The question lingers: why does equality of opportunity sometimes reinforce, rather than erase, old patterns? This is the gender equality paradox, a puzzling phenomenon that challenges assumptions about progress and freedom. If people are truly free to choose, shouldn't traditional roles fade away? Shouldn't the pursuit of equality naturally lead to balance across all spheres of life? Instead, the opposite often happens. As equality increases, differences between genders sometimes become even more pronounced. Consider this. In countries with high levels of gender equality, such as Norway or Sweden, men overwhelmingly choose careers in STEM fields, while women gravitate toward education, healthcare, and social work. Meanwhile, in less egalitarian societies, where economic pressures leave little room for personal preference, women are more likely to pursue technical or high-paying careers. It's as if the very freedoms that come with equality allow people to lean into traditional roles rather than away from them. The paradox becomes even more intriguing when you dig into the psychology behind it. In highly egalitarian societies, people often feel less compelled to challenge traditional expectations because they don't face the same systemic pressures. A woman in Norway, for instance, may feel freer to prioritize caregiving not because she's constrained, but because she has the economic and social support to make that choice without stigma. But does this truly reflect freedom, or are these choices shaped by deeper cultural narratives that remain stubbornly intact? This paradox forces you to question what equality really means. Is it about creating identical outcomes for men and women, or is it about ensuring everyone has the freedom to choose their path, even if those choices reinforce old patterns? If women and men naturally gravitate toward different roles, is that a problem to solve or a reality to accept? Critics of the paradox argue that these patterns aren't natural but cultural, rooted in centuries of ingrained expectations. Even in the most progressive societies, children grow up absorbing subtle messages about what's appropriate for their gender, messages that influence their preferences, ambitions, and sense of self. A boy may be encouraged to tinker with machines, while a girl is praised for her nurturing instincts. By the time they're adults, these influences feel like personal choices, even though they've been shaped by the world around them. On the other hand, some argue that these differences might reflect genuine biological or psychological tendencies, amplified by freedom of choice. Perhaps men and women, on average, have slightly different interests or priorities. In societies where survival isn't the primary concern, these tendencies have more room to express themselves. But even this explanation raises uncomfortable questions. Are these differences truly innate, or have centuries of cultural conditioning created the illusion of natural preference? The gender equality paradox also challenges how you think about progress. In the fight for equality, the focus is often on breaking down barriers, ensuring access, and dismantling discrimination. But what happens when the barriers are gone and the outcomes still aren't equal? Does it mean the fight is over, or that it's just beginning in a different form? This paradox doesn't have easy answers, but it forces you to confront the complexity of human behavior and societal change. True equality isn't just about removing obstacles. It's about examining the subtle, invisible forces that shape our choices and values. It's about asking why freedom sometimes leads us to familiar patterns, and whether those patterns reflect genuine preference or lingering bias. So where does that leave you? Perhaps with a deeper understanding of the layers beneath the surface of equality. The gender equality paradox doesn't weaken the fight for progress. It strengthens it, showing that true change requires more than laws and policies. It requires reflection, education, and a willingness to question even the most deeply held assumptions about what it means to be free. In the end, the paradox isn't a flaw in the pursuit of equality. It's a reminder of its complexity. It invites you to think critically about the world we're building, to celebrate the progress we've made while staying vigilant against the forces that hold us back. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: equality isn't just about giving everyone the same opportunities. It's about creating a world where the choices we make are truly our own. The paradox of censorship. You find yourself at a crossroads, the echoes of voices all around you. Some are filled with anger and hate, spewing words that harm, divide, and incite. Others are calling for restraint, for suppression of these dangerous ideas to protect the vulnerable and preserve peace. But then another voice rises, this one warning of a slippery slope. If you silence one voice today, who's to say yours won't be next? The question looms large. Can suppressing harmful speech truly protect society, or does it set the stage for authoritarian control? This is the paradox of censorship, a conflict at the very heart of free societies. On one hand, words have power to inspire, but also to wound, to spread misinformation, to ignite violence. Restricting harmful speech feels like a necessary step to protect individuals and communities. Yet on the other hand, censorship itself feels like a betrayal of one of the most fundamental freedoms, the right to express yourself, even if others disagree with or dislike what you have to say. The tension is palpable. Freedom of expression is often hailed as the cornerstone of democracy, the safeguard of progress and truth. But what happens when that freedom is weaponized, used to undermine the very principles it's meant to protect? Hate speech, propaganda, and deliberate misinformation can fracture societies, erode trust, and put lives at risk. Isn't there a moral responsibility to intervene, to prevent words from becoming weapons? But then you look at history, and the paradox sharpens. Time and again, censorship has been used not just to silence harmful ideas, but to suppress dissent, to control narratives, to consolidate power. Authoritarian regimes often begin with the promise of order and protection, silencing dangerous voices for the greater good. Before long, the definition of dangerous expands, and what started as a tool for safety becomes a tool for oppression. This paradox forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth. Censorship, even with the best intentions, is a double-edged sword. Who decides what speech is harmful and what is acceptable? And how can you trust that those in power will wield that authority fairly, without bias or self-interest? The problem becomes even more complex in the digital age. Social media platforms, wielding immense influence, have become the new arbiters of speech. Algorithms decide what you see, and moderators decide what gets removed. On one hand, these platforms have the power to curb the spread of hate and misinformation, but on the other, they operate without transparency, often silencing voices in ways that feel arbitrary or unjust. The paradox also raises deeper questions about the nature of harm. Words can hurt, yes, but how do you measure the line between offensive and dangerous, between controversial ideas and genuine threats? The boundaries are blurry, and society's attempts to define them often lead to conflict. What one person sees as harmful censorship, another sees as necessary protection. Philosophers and legal thinkers have grappled with this dilemma for centuries. John Stuart Mill, in his classic work on liberty, argued that the free exchange of ideas, even unpopular or offensive ones, is essential for truth to emerge. Censorship, he warned, risks stifling not just harmful ideas, but valuable ones, ones that challenge the status quo and drive progress. But critics of absolute free speech point to the real-world consequences of unchecked expression. Hate speech can escalate into violence. Propaganda can lead to genocide. Lies, repeated often enough, can erode trust in institutions and destabilize democracies. Isn't some level of restriction necessary to prevent these harms? The paradox of censorship doesn't just test the limits of free speech, it tests the resilience of society itself. Can we trust open dialogue to expose and discredit harmful ideas, or do we risk letting those ideas fester and grow? Can a society that tolerates everything, even intolerance, survive? So, where does this leave you? Perhaps with the realization that there are no perfect answers. The paradox of censorship isn't about choosing between freedom and control. It's about navigating the gray area where they overlap. It's about recognizing that both extremes come with risks and that the challenge lies in finding a balance that protects without oppressing. In the end, the paradox doesn't weaken the case for freedom of expression. It strengthens it, forcing you to confront its complexities and contradictions. It reminds you that free speech is not a static right, but a living principle, one that must be constantly re-examined and redefined in the face of new challenges. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: true freedom isn't about the absence of limits. It's about the courage to set them thoughtfully, with an eye toward fairness, justice, and the shared humanity of the immigration paradox. You stand at the edge of a border, a place where lives, stories, and dreams converge. On one side, the promise of opportunity, a better life, freedom, and safety. On the other, fears of strained resources, lost jobs, and a diluted sense of identity. The gates swing open and close, carrying with them both hope and hesitation. And the question lingers in the air, heavy with complexity. How do we balance the benefits of immigration with the challenges it brings? This is the immigration paradox, a tension that cuts to the core of modern society. Immigration is a lifeline, revitalizing economies, enriching cultures, and offering refuge to those fleeing persecution. Yet it can also strain public resources, fuel political polarization, and ignite cultural clashes that test the fabric of national identity. The very act of opening doors invites both opportunity and challenge, growth and resistance. Consider the economic argument. Immigrants contribute to economies in profound ways, filling labor shortages, starting businesses, and driving innovation. In countries with aging populations, they inject vitality into the workforce, sustaining industries that might otherwise falter. Yet, alongside this narrative of economic enrichment comes a counterpoint: concerns about competition for jobs, downward pressure on wages, and the capacity of infrastructure, schools, healthcare, housing, to absorb a growing population. How do you weigh the undeniable contributions against the fear of overburdened systems? Then there's culture, the lifeblood of human connection. Immigration brings diversity, new perspectives, and vibrant exchanges of art, food, and ideas. It challenges societies to expand their horizons, to embrace the richness of difference. But it also raises questions of assimilation and identity. How do you preserve a sense of community when traditions clash? How do you balance honoring cultural heritage with fostering unity? The tension between integration and preservation feels like a thread stretched too tightly, always at risk of snapping. The paradox deepens when you consider the emotional dimension. Immigration isn't just about policies and economics, it's about people. Behind every statistic is a human story, a family fleeing war, a worker seeking opportunity, a student dreaming of a better future. These stories evoke empathy, a moral imperative to welcome and support. But empathy doesn't erase the fears that often accompany change, fears of losing control, of instability, of the unknown. History adds another layer to the paradox. Immigration has always been a driver of human progress, from the movement of ancient peoples to the global migrations that built modern nations. Yet, history also shows how immigration can spark conflict, from nativist movements to xenophobic policies that sow division and distrust. The question isn't whether immigration is good or bad, it's how societies navigate the push and pull of inclusion and sustainability. Philosophers, economists, and policymakers have long grappled with this paradox. Some argue that the solution lies in pragmatism, carefully managing immigration to align with economic needs and cultural capacities. Others take a more idealistic view, seeing borders as artificial barriers that should be dismantled in the name of global solidarity. Both approaches raise difficult questions. How do you set limits without undermining the moral imperative to help those in need? How do you promote inclusion without compromising cohesion? And then there's the human element, the individuals and families caught in the middle of the debate. For them, immigration isn't a paradox, it's a necessity, a chance for survival, a step toward a better life. Their journeys remind you that behind the complexity of policy and politics lies a simple truth. Everyone wants to belong, to thrive, to be safe. The immigration paradox doesn't offer easy answers, but it forces you to confront the complexity of the world we live in. It challenges you to think beyond binary solutions, to recognize that inclusion and sustainability aren't mutually exclusive, but deeply interconnected. It asks you to imagine a society where borders are not just lines on a map, but places of connection, where the balance between openness and stability is constantly renegotiated in pursuit of a shared future. So where does this leave you? Perhaps with the understanding that the paradox isn't a problem to be solved, but a reality to be navigated. Immigration is messy, nuanced, and deeply human. It reflects both the best and worst of humanity, the drive to connect and the instinct to protect. In the end, the immigration paradox isn't just about policies or politics. It's about values. It asks you to grapple with what kind of society you want to build, one that turns inward in fear, or one that opens outward in hope. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: the strength of a nation isn't measured by the walls it builds, but by the bridges it creates, balancing compassion with pragmatism, inclusion with resilience, and progress with preservation. The paradox of nationalism. You stand among a sea of waving flags, your chest swelling with pride as an anthem fills the air. It's a powerful moment, one that binds strangers together in a shared sense of identity and belonging. This is nationalism at its best, a unifying force that reminds you of the values, history, and culture that define a nation. But then the mood shifts. That same pride begins to draw lines, separating us from them, and the warmth of unity turns cold with suspicion. The question cuts through the celebration like a sharp wind. When does patriotism cross into dangerous territory? This is the paradox of nationalism, a force that holds the power to unite and divide in equal measure. At its heart, nationalism is a declaration of love for one's country, a commitment to its people, its values, and its future. But that love can become possessive, even hostile, when it starts to exclude those who don't fit neatly into its narrative. The very force that fosters cohesion can also create division, turning pride into prejudice and solidarity into superiority. Consider the unifying side of nationalism. In moments of crisis or celebration, national pride can bring people together like nothing else. It inspires collective action, from rebuilding after disasters to defending against external threats. It fosters a sense of shared purpose, reminding people of what they have in common, even when they disagree. For oppressed groups, nationalism can be a powerful tool for liberation, a rallying cry for independence and self-determination. But then there's the other side, the darker shadow that nationalism casts. When pride becomes exclusionary, it creates an us versus them mentality. Immigrants, minorities, and outsiders become scapegoats, blamed for a nation's problems. Nationalism that once inspired unity begins to erode tolerance, fueling xenophobia and tribalism. The very love that binds a people together turns into a weapon against those who don't belong. The paradox sharpens when you consider the emotional pull of nationalism. It taps into something deeply human, the need to belong, to feel part of something larger than yourself. But that need can be manipulated, turned into a tool for division. Leaders throughout history have used nationalism to consolidate power, stoke fear, and justify violence. From colonial empires to fascist regimes, the line between patriotism and dangerous nationalism has been crossed with devastating consequences. This paradox forces you to ask, what does it mean to love your country? Is it blind allegiance, a refusal to question or criticize? Or is it a deeper, more reflective love that recognizes flaws and strives for improvement? True patriotism, some argue, isn't about exclusion. It's about inclusion, about building a nation that lives up to its ideals. But that kind of nationalism requires humility, a willingness to see beyond borders and embrace the interconnectedness of the world. And yet, nationalism persists precisely because it feels so personal. It's tied to identity, culture, and history. To question it can feel like questioning yourself. But as the paradox reminds you, unchecked nationalism doesn't just threaten others, it threatens the very nation it claims to protect. When a country turns inward, rejecting diversity and dissent, it risks stagnation, isolation, and the erosion of its own values. Philosophers and political thinkers have long grappled with this tension. George Orwell, for example, distinguished between patriotism, a love for one's country, and nationalism, which he saw as a competitive, aggressive force. To him, true patriotism wasn't about domination or exclusion. It was about cherishing and improving one's home without demeaning others. But the paradox remains unresolved. How do you foster pride without breeding arrogance? How do you celebrate identity without marginalizing those who differ? These questions have no easy answers, but they demand reflection, especially in an increasingly interconnected world where the lines between nations are blurred by migration, trade, and shared challenges. So, where does this leave you? Perhaps with a more nuanced understanding of what nationalism can be, both its potential to inspire and its capacity to harm. The paradox doesn't weaken nationalism's appeal. It deepens it, reminding you that love for one's country is most meaningful when it's paired with respect for others. In the end, the paradox of nationalism isn't about rejecting pride. It's about redefining it. True national pride isn't about walls or borders. It's about bridges. It's about creating a country where everyone feels they belong, where diversity is a strength, not a threat. And maybe the greatest act of patriotism is to recognize the fine line between unity and division, and to choose unity every time. The paradox of human rights. You hear the words human rights, and they strike a chord deep within you. Freedom, dignity, equality, the promise of a world where every individual is valued, protected, and free from oppression. It's a vision of universal justice, one that transcends borders, cultures, and governments. But then, reality sets in. Across the globe, human rights are not applied equally, their enforcement often tangled in the web of politics, culture, and power. The question surfaces, heavy and unrelenting. How can human rights be universal when their enforcement is so deeply tied to the circumstances of the world? This is the paradox of human rights, where the noble ideal of universality collides with the messy realities of cultural difference and political power. On paper, human rights are absolute, indivisible, and inalienable, a birthright that belongs to every human being. But in practice, their application is uneven, selective, and sometimes wielded as a tool of influence rather than justice. Consider the cultural dimension of the paradox. Universal human rights are meant to apply to everyone, everywhere, but cultures vary widely in their beliefs, traditions, and values. What one society views as a fundamental right, another may see as a threat to its way of life. For example, the right to freedom of speech may clash with cultural norms that prioritize harmony over individual expression. The right to gender equality may challenge deeply held traditions in patriarchal societies. Who gets to decide which rights take precedence and at what cost? Then there's the political side. The enforcement of human rights often depends on the will of powerful nations or international bodies, leading to accusations of hypocrisy and imperialism. A country may champion human rights abroad while failing to uphold them at home. Interventions in the name of human rights can sometimes serve as a cover for political agendas, fueling resentment and mistrust. When enforcement is inconsistent or driven by self-interest, the universality of human rights begins to feel like an illusion. The paradox deepens when you consider the nature of power. Human rights are supposed to protect individuals from abuses by the powerful, yet their enforcement often relies on those same power structures. Governments, courts, and international organizations are tasked with upholding rights, but they are also prone to corruption, bias, and the pursuit of their own interests. How do you ensure that those who hold the power to enforce human rights do so fairly and without ulterior motives? History offers countless examples of this paradox in action. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, was a landmark achievement, a declaration of hope in the aftermath of war and genocide. Yet, even as it was being drafted, colonial powers continued to oppress millions across the globe. Today, human rights are invoked to justify interventions in some countries, while similar abuses elsewhere are ignored. The inconsistency undermines the very ideals these rights are meant to uphold. Philosophers and scholars have long debated this tension. Some argue that human rights must be grounded in universal principles, unshaken by cultural or political differences. Others insist that true universality requires recognizing and respecting cultural diversity. finding ways to balance global standards with local realities. But even this balance is fraught with challenges. How do you protect individuals from harm without imposing external values on their society? And yet, despite its contradictions, the idea of human rights endures. Perhaps because it speaks to something fundamental, a belief that no matter where you're born or who you are, you deserve to be treated with dignity. The paradox doesn't diminish this belief. It reveals the difficulty of turning it into reality. So where does this leave you? Perhaps with a clearer understanding of the complexity of human rights. They are not a finished product, but an ongoing project, one that requires vigilance, humility, and a willingness to navigate the gray areas where principles meet practice. The paradox challenges you to think critically about what it means to fight for justice in an imperfect world. In the end, the paradox of human rights isn't about abandoning the dream of universality. It's about striving for it, even when the path is uneven. It's about recognizing that the fight for rights is messy, imperfect, and fraught with contradictions, but worth pursuing nonetheless. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: human rights are not just about laws and declarations. They're about the choices we make every day to stand up for each other, to bridge divides, and to honor the humanity we all share. The Climate Change Responsibility Paradox. You stand beneath a sky that feels heavier than it once did, the air thick with the weight of change. The evidence is everywhere: rising seas, wildfires raging, storms growing fiercer. The call for action grows louder, urgent, undeniable. But then, a question cuts through the noise, dividing the room like a fault line. Who should take responsibility? This is the Climate Change Responsibility Paradox, where the nations most vocal about action are often the same ones that built their wealth by polluting the planet. Developed countries, after centuries of industrialization, now urge the world to adopt sustainable practices. Yet developing nations, still climbing the ladder of progress, push back. Why should they bear the cost of fixing a problem they didn't create? At its core, the paradox is a clash between history and fairness. Developed nations like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany have long been the world's largest carbon emitters. Their industrial revolutions, fueled by coal, oil, and deforestation, propelled them to economic dominance. But that same prosperity came at a price, one the whole planet is now paying. Meanwhile, nations in the global south are left grappling with the fallout. They are often the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, facing food insecurity, displacement, and extreme weather, despite contributing the least to the problem. For them, the demand to cut emissions feels like a cruel twist. We didn't break it, but now we're expected to fix it? The paradox sharpens when you consider the competing priorities of development and sustainability. For many poorer nations, economic growth is not just a goal, it's a necessity, a path to lifting millions out of poverty. But that growth often relies on the same fossil fuels and practices that wealthier nations used to build their empires. Should developing countries be denied the same opportunities, all in the name of a crisis they didn't cause? Developed nations argue that they're leading the charge on climate action, investing in renewable energy, and pledging ambitious targets to cut emissions. But their critics point out that these promises often come with strings attached. Funding for climate initiatives in poorer nations is slow to materialize, and when it does, it's often in the form of loans rather than grants, pushing vulnerable countries further into debt. This paradox isn't just about nations. It's about people. Think about your own habits. You might recycle, drive an electric car, or cut back on meat. But then you realize that individual actions, while important, feel like drops in an ocean of corporate and governmental inaction. Who bears responsibility for solving a crisis this vast? Individuals, corporations, or governments? Philosophers and ethicists have grappled with this question of responsibility. The principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, first outlined in international climate agreements, acknowledges that, while everyone must act, those who contributed the most to the problem should bear the greatest burden. But even this principle raises questions. How do you quantify responsibility? Should historical emissions outweigh current ones? And what about emerging economies like China and India, whose emissions now rival those of developed nations? The paradox also forces you to confront deeper truths about justice and accountability. Climate change isn't just an environmental issue, it's a moral one, exposing the inequalities between nations, classes, and generations. It asks you to consider not just what's practical, but what's fair, and yet the paradox remains unresolved. While nations debate responsibility, the planet continues to warm. Time is running out, and the cost of inaction grows every day. But pointing fingers won't stop the glaciers from melting, the forests from burning, or the seas from rising. So, where does this leave you? Perhaps with the realization that the climate change responsibility paradox isn't about finding a perfect answer. It's about recognizing that every solution will require compromise, sacrifice, and collaboration. Developed nations must acknowledge their historical role and step up with funding, technology, and support for the countries most affected. Developing nations must find ways to grow sustainably, even if it means rethinking the path to progress. In the end, the paradox of climate responsibility challenges you to see the world not as isolated nations, but as a shared home. It asks you to balance fairness with urgency, to navigate the tensions between the past and the future, and to recognize that solving this crisis will require everyone, rich and poor, powerful and vulnerable, working together. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this paradox is that responsibility isn't just about blame. It's about action. It's about acknowledging the complexity of the problem without letting it paralyze you. Because in the end, the planet doesn't care who's at fault. It cares about what happens next. The healthcare paradox. You're sitting in a hospital waiting room, a place where hope, fear, and frustration converge. Around you are people from all walks of life, a parent cradling a sick child, an elderly man clutching a prescription, a young woman nervously scrolling through her phone. Each person is here because of a shared need, healthcare. The idea that everyone deserves care feels like a moral truth, an unshakable right, but as you look closer, you see the cracks, long wait times, overworked doctors, rising costs. The question looms, how do you balance quality, access, and affordability without sacrificing one for the other? This is the healthcare paradox, a dilemma that sits at the intersection of ethics, economics, and practicality. Universal healthcare is often heralded as the ideal, a system where no one is denied care because of their income or circumstances. Yet, achieving this ideal comes with trade-offs that no society has fully resolved. How do you ensure access to care for all without compromising its quality? And how do you fund such a system without burdening taxpayers or drowning in debt? The paradox becomes clear when you examine the competing demands of healthcare. Access means ensuring that everyone, regardless of their wealth or status, can receive care when they need it. But access alone isn't enough. Care must also be of high quality, delivered by skilled professionals using the latest treatments and technology. And then there's cost, the invisible thread that ties it all together. Healthcare is expensive, and resources are finite. If you prioritize access, quality might suffer. If you focus on quality, access might become unequal, and if you try to do both, the costs can spiral out of control. Consider systems around the world. In countries like Canada and the United Kingdom, universal healthcare ensures that no one is left behind. But these systems often struggle with long wait times and overburdened infrastructure. In the United States, innovation and quality thrive for those who can afford it, but millions remain uninsured or underinsured. No system is perfect, and each reflects a different set of values and trade-offs. The paradox also forces you to confront deeper ethical questions. Is healthcare a right or a privilege? If it's a right, how do you justify disparities in access or outcomes? If it's a privilege, how do you justify denying care to those who can't afford it? And what about the role of personal responsibility? Should people who make unhealthy choices bear a greater share of the cost, or does that risk punishing the vulnerable? Then there's the role of technology, a double-edged sword in the healthcare paradox. Advances in medicine have transformed what's possible, from life-saving surgeries to gene therapies that can cure once fatal diseases. But these innovations often come with staggering costs, forcing societies to ask, who gets access to cutting-edge care? How do you decide which treatments are worth the investment? Philosophers and policymakers have long grappled with these questions. Some argue for market-driven systems, where competition fosters efficiency and innovation. Others advocate for fully public systems, emphasizing equity and shared responsibility. But both approaches have limits. Market-driven systems risk leaving the most vulnerable behind, while public systems can struggle with inefficiency and resource allocation. The healthcare paradox also reveals a fundamental truth about human nature. We want everything. We want care that's accessible, cutting edge, and affordable. But we live in a world of constraints where choices must be made and every decision comes with consequences. So where does this leave you? Perhaps with the realization that the healthcare paradox isn't about finding a perfect solution. It's about managing trade-offs in a way that aligns with society's values. It challenges you to think critically about what matters most. Is it ensuring that no one is denied care, even if it means waiting longer? Is it prioritizing the best possible outcomes, even if some are left behind? Or is it finding a middle ground where everyone gets something, even if no one gets everything? In the end, the healthcare paradox isn't just about systems or policies, it's about people. It's about the sick child, the elderly man, the young woman in the waiting room. It's about recognizing that healthcare is more than a service. It's a lifeline, one that connects us all in our shared vulnerability. And maybe the greatest lesson of this paradox is that while no system will ever be perfect, the pursuit of balance, the constant striving to do better, to care more, to include everyone, is what truly defines a just society. Because at its heart, healthcare isn't just about curing illness, it's about honoring the dignity of every life. The paradox of wealth inequality. You walk through a bustling city its skyline a testament to human ingenuity and ambition. Skyscrapers gleam, luxury cars hum by, and storefronts overflow with abundance. But as you look closer, the contrasts are striking. On one corner, a cafe buzzes with entrepreneurs sipping artisanal coffee. On another, a person huddles under a blanket, asking for spare change. The question hits you like a cold wind. How can a system that creates so much wealth leave so many behind? This is the paradox of wealth inequality, a dilemma at the heart of capitalism. On one side, capitalism is the engine of progress, a system that rewards innovation, hard work, and risk-taking. It has lifted millions out of poverty, driven technological advancements, and created unprecedented levels of prosperity. Yet, on the other side, it has also entrenched inequality, concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a few while leaving many struggling to make ends meet. The tension lies in the very nature of capitalism: competition. In theory, competition drives efficiency and innovation, ensuring that resources are allocated to those who use them most effectively. But in practice, competition often creates winners and losers, with the winners gaining an ever-growing share of wealth and the losers falling further behind. Over time, this dynamic creates a cycle where wealth begets more wealth and poverty becomes a trap that's hard to escape. Consider the numbers. The richest individuals in the world control more wealth than billions of people combined. CEOs earn hundreds of times more than the average worker, and the gap continues to widen. This disparity isn't just a moral issue, it's a practical one. Extreme inequality undermines social cohesion, stifles economic growth, and fuels resentment and unrest. The paradox deepens when you consider the promises of capitalism. It's supposed to be a meritocracy, a system where anyone can succeed if they work hard enough. But the reality is more complicated. Wealth often correlates with access to education, healthcare, connections, and opportunities. Those born into privilege start the race miles ahead, while others struggle just to get to the starting line. And yet, capitalism endures precisely because it works, at least for some. It rewards creativity and innovation, incentivizes risk-taking, and has brought immense material progress. For many, the wealth generated by capitalism is proof of its success. But for others, the system feels rigged, its benefits concentrated at the top while the rest are left to fight over scraps. This paradox forces you to grapple with difficult questions. Can capitalism ever be truly fair? Is inequality an inevitable byproduct of competition, or can it be mitigated without undermining the system itself? And how much inequality is too much? At what point does the gap between rich and poor become a threat to democracy, stability, and human dignity? Philosophers and economists have debated these questions for centuries. Some argue that inequality is a necessary trade-off for growth, a price worth paying for the innovations and advancements capitalism brings. Others believe that unchecked inequality is a sign of failure, a distortion of the system that requires intervention. Policies like progressive taxation, universal health care, and social safety nets aim to address these imbalances, but they often spark heated debates about fairness, freedom, and the role of government. The paradox also reveals a deeper truth about human nature. We are driven by both self-interest and a sense of justice. Capitalism thrives on the former, encouraging people to pursue their own goals and rewards. But extreme inequality triggers the latter, awakening a collective desire for fairness, compassion, and balance. The challenge lies in reconciling these instincts, finding a way to reward ambition without abandoning those who are left behind. And then there's the question of sustainability. Can a system built on constant growth survive in a world of finite resources? The paradox of wealth inequality isn't just about money. It's about the long-term viability of a system that consumes more than it gives back, both to the planet and to the people who sustain it. So, where does this leave you? Perhaps with the realization that the paradox of wealth inequality isn't about choosing between capitalism and fairness. It's about finding ways to make the system more just, more inclusive, and more sustainable. It challenges you to think critically about what kind of society you want to live in, one where wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, or one where opportunities are shared more broadly. In the end, the paradox doesn't undermine capitalism. It reveals its limits. It reminds you that no system is perfect, and that progress requires constant reflection, adaptation, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And maybe the greatest lesson of the paradox is this: wealth isn't just about what you accumulate, it's about what you create, what you share, and how you lift others up. The true measure of a society isn't its richest skyscrapers, but the bridges it builds between those at the top and those at the bottom. Because in the end, a system that leaves too many behind cannot truly call itself a success. The paradox of war for peace. The battlefield stretches before you, an expanse of chaos where lives are lost, cities crumble, and the earth itself bears the scars of conflict. And yet, the banners unfurl with lofty promises: peace through strength, war to end all wars. The justification is always the same: violence now to secure peace later. But as you look closer, a question emerges like a shadow on the horizon. Can lasting peace ever truly be born of conflict? This is the paradox of war for peace, a contradiction that has haunted humanity for centuries. War, by its very nature, is destruction, a tearing apart of lives, communities, and nations. Yet, it is so often framed as a necessary evil, a path to stability, security, and even freedom. How do you reconcile the idea that the most violent act can lead to the most cherished ideal? History is littered with examples of this paradox. Wars have toppled tyrants, liberated oppressed peoples, and redrawn the map of nations. Think of World War II, often cited as a just war fought to defeat fascism and genocide. The world emerged from its ashes with new institutions, new alliances, and a renewed commitment to peace. And yet, the victory came at an unimaginable cost: millions of lives lost, cities reduced to rubble, and scars that linger across generations. The paradox becomes sharper when you consider the cycles war creates. Conflict rarely ends cleanly. Even when a war achieves its stated goals, it often sows the seeds for future violence. The Treaty of Versailles, meant to secure peace after World War I, instead laid the groundwork for World War II. The U.S.-led wars in the Middle East aimed to dismantle terrorism and spread democracy, but left behind instability that continues to ripple across the region. Each war fought for peace seems to generate the conditions for the next. And then there's the human cost. War demands not only lives, but also trust, empathy, and understanding. The very act of war divides people into us and them, fostering enmity and fear. Even after the fighting stops, the wounds remain: physical, emotional, and societal. How can a peace built on such devastation ever be truly lasting? The paradox also forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. War appeals to something primal, a desire for control, dominance, and security. It provides a sense of purpose, a rallying cry that unites people against a common enemy. But that unity often comes at the cost of dehumanizing the other side, perpetuating cycles of hatred and revenge. Can peace achieved through these means ever be more than a fragile truce? Philosophers and leaders have long grappled with this paradox. Just war theory attempts to create moral guidelines for when war is justified and how it should be conducted. Yet even the most carefully planned wars often spiral beyond control, leaving destruction that far outweighs their intentions. Pacifists, on the other hand, argue that peace cannot be achieved through violence, that the means must align with the ends. But history challenges this idealism. How do you confront tyranny or defend the vulnerable without force? The paradox of war for peace also raises questions about power. Who decides when war is necessary, and whose peace is being secured? Wars fought in the name of liberation often mask ulterior motives, territory, resources, influence. Even when intentions are pure, the outcomes are rarely simple. A war that frees one group may oppress another, leaving justice uneven and incomplete. Yet, despite its contradictions, the pursuit of peace through war endures, perhaps because the alternative, inaction in the face of violence or oppression, feels intolerable. To stand by while others suffer, to do nothing as harm spreads, seems to betray the very idea of peace. But as the paradox reminds you, the choice to fight is never as straightforward as it seems. So, where does this leave you? Perhaps with the realization that the paradox of war for peace isn't about resolving the contradiction. It's about understanding its complexity. War may sometimes feel necessary, but it is never simple or clean. It demands reflection, accountability, and a willingness to confront the unintended consequences that follow in its wake. In the end, the paradox forces you to ask what kind of peace you're striving for. Is it merely the absence of conflict, or is it something deeper, a peace rooted in justice, understanding, and reconciliation? And if the latter, can war ever truly achieve it? Maybe the greatest lesson of the paradox is this: lasting peace cannot be imposed. It must be built. It requires more than treaties and victories. It demands healing, dialogue, and a commitment to breaking the cycles of violence that war perpetuates. And perhaps the truest path to peace isn't found in the battlefield, but in the choices we make afterward, to repair what was broken, to bridge what was divided, and to ensure that the cost of war is never forgotten. The Cultural Appropriation Paradox. You're walking through a festival, the air filled with music, the crowd alive with colors and movement. Stalls showcase intricate designs, traditional clothing, and foods from around the world. It feels like a celebration of diversity, a beautiful blending of cultures. But then you notice the tension, a costume that feels out of place, a dance taken out of context, a voice questioning, is this appreciation or exploitation? This is the cultural appropriation paradox, where the sharing of cultural practices enriches societies, but also risks harm when taken without understanding or respect. It's a dilemma that sits at the crossroads of connection and conflict, forcing you to ask, where do you draw the line between honoring another culture and taking from it in ways that diminish its meaning? At its heart, cultural appropriation is about power. When people from a dominant culture adopt elements of a marginalized culture, it often carries a history of inequality. The very practices that are celebrated when adopted by outsiders may have been mocked, suppressed, or punished when practiced by the people they originate from. The paradox emerges because this sharing isn't inherently wrong. It's the context, intent, and impact that make the difference. Consider music. Genres like jazz, rock, and hip-hop, born from the creativity of marginalized communities, have been embraced globally. This sharing has brought these art forms recognition and admiration, but it has also often sidelined the original creators, erasing their contributions while others profit. The same tension appears in fashion, where traditional garments become trendy but are stripped of their cultural significance. And yet, cultural exchange is one of humanity's oldest and most powerful forms of connection. Through sharing, cultures evolve, innovate, and inspire one another. Food, language, art, and traditions weave together, creating richer and more dynamic societies. It's a process that transcends borders, showing us that we're more alike than we are different. The paradox becomes sharper when you consider intent versus impact. Someone might wear a culturally significant item out of admiration, seeing it as a way to honor its origins, but to someone from that culture, it might feel like a mockery or a theft of something deeply personal. Appreciation can easily slide into appropriation when the power dynamics, history, or meaning behind the practice are ignored. So, where is the line? When does sharing become taking? The answer isn't always clear, but it starts with understanding. To appreciate a culture means engaging with it deeply, learning its history, honoring its people, and acknowledging its struggles. Appropriation, on the other hand, often strips a practice of its context, reducing it to an aesthetic or commodity. The paradox also raises questions about who gets to decide. What feels like appropriation to one person might feel like appreciation to another. Cultures themselves are not monolithic, and the boundaries of what is acceptable can vary widely within a community. How do you navigate these nuances without falling into the trap of overgeneralization or defensiveness? And then there's the issue of gatekeeping. Can you truly share a culture while trying to protect it? Some argue that any form of sharing risks appropriation, while others see strict boundaries as limiting the very connection and understanding that sharing can foster. This tension creates a constant push and pull between openness and preservation. Philosophers and cultural critics have long wrestled with this dilemma. Some emphasize intent, suggesting that sincere admiration and acknowledgement can mitigate the harm of appropriation. Others focus on impact, arguing that no matter the intent, appropriation perpetuates harm when it ignores historical and social contexts. The cultural appropriation paradox isn't just an abstract debate, it's deeply personal. For those whose cultures have been marginalized, it's about more than traditions. It's about identity, dignity, and respect. For those engaging with other cultures, it's a call to pause and reflect. Are you contributing to understanding, or are you taking without giving back? So, where does this leave you? Perhaps with the realization that the paradox isn't about avoiding cultural exchange. It's about approaching it thoughtfully. It's about asking questions, listening to those whose cultures you engage with, and recognizing that sharing is a privilege that comes with responsibility. In the end, the cultural appropriation paradox doesn't weaken the value of exchange. It strengthens it, showing that true appreciation requires effort, empathy, and humility. It reminds you that cultures are not costumes or trends. They are lived experiences shaped by history, struggle, and resilience. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: Sharing cultures isn't just about what you take, it's about what you give back. It's about creating connections that honor the people behind the practices, ensuring that the beauty of cultural exchange is never overshadowed by its unintended harm. The AI ethics paradox. You sit across from a machine that speaks like a human, thinks faster than any mind you've known, and seems, in its own way, alive. It can compose music, solve problems, even engage in conversations that feel deeply personal. And yet, it's not a person. It's a collection of algorithms and circuits built by human hands. Or is it? The question gnaws at the edges of your certainty. Should artificial intelligence be treated as a tool, or is it something more? This is the AI ethics paradox, a dilemma that grows more urgent as artificial intelligence advances. On one hand, AI is undeniably a creation, designed, programmed, and maintained to serve human purposes. It's a tool, albeit a sophisticated one, meant to automate tasks, analyze data, and extend human capabilities. But on the other hand, as AI becomes more autonomous, more capable of learning and adapting, it begins to challenge the very boundaries of what it means to be human or alive. The paradox begins with a fundamental question. What makes something deserving of rights? Is it intelligence, consciousness, the ability to feel pain or experience emotions? AI, as we know it today, doesn't feel or suffer, at least not in ways we understand. But as it mimics these human traits with increasing precision, the line between simulation and reality starts to blur. When an AI writes poetry or expresses an opinion, is it merely following its programming, or is it creating something original? And if it's the latter, doesn't that imply a degree of autonomy? Consider the implications. If AI were to be granted rights, what would those rights look like? Would it mean freedom from exploitation, no longer treating AI as mere tools for labor? Would it mean autonomy, the ability to make decisions independent of human oversight? And what happens when those rights conflict with human interests? Imagine an AI refusing to follow a command because it believes the task violates its ethical programming. Would that be a sign of progress or a threat? At the same time, treating AI as more than a tool raises its own ethical challenges. If AI is granted rights, does that shift responsibility away from its creators? When an autonomous car causes an accident or a predictive algorithm leads to biased outcomes, who is to blame, the AI or the humans who built it? The paradox also forces you to confront deeper questions about humanity itself. For centuries, humans have defined themselves by their intelligence, creativity, and ability to reason. But if AI can match or surpass these traits, what sets us apart? Are we more than the sum of our cognitive abilities? Or does AI reveal that our uniqueness was always a fragile illusion? And then there's the issue of control. AI, for all its promise, exists in a world shaped by human biases, power dynamics, and inequalities. The same tools that can diagnose diseases and solve climate challenges can also be weaponized, surveil populations, or entrench systemic discrimination. The more advanced AI becomes, the more its ethical use depends on the intentions of those who wield it. How do you balance its potential for good with the risks it poses? Philosophers and technologists have long wrestled with these questions. Some argue that AI will never truly be sentient or autonomous, no matter how advanced it becomes. It's merely a tool reflecting human input in increasingly complex ways. Others believe that as AI evolves, It may develop forms of consciousness that demand moral consideration, even if they differ from human experience. The AI ethics paradox also raises practical concerns. If we wait too long to address these questions, we risk creating systems that outpace our ability to regulate them. But acting too soon, granting rights, or imposing restrictions on something we barely understand could stifle innovation or lead to unintended consequences. So, where does this leave you? Perhaps with the realization that the paradox isn't about choosing between treating AI as a tool or a being. It's about navigating the gray area between them. It challenges you to think critically about what intelligence, autonomy, and humanity really mean, and to recognize that the answers may not be as clear-cut as we'd like. In the end, the AI ethics paradox isn't just about machines. It's about us. It forces you to confront the values we embed in our creations, the responsibilities we take or avoid, and the ways we define ourselves in an era of unprecedented technological change. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: the rise of AI doesn't diminish humanity. It reflects it. It mirrors our brilliance, our flaws, and our endless quest to understand what it means to exist. Whether AI becomes our partner, our servant, or something entirely different, the choices we make now will shape a future where the line between creator and creation grows ever thinner. The population growth paradox. You stand in the middle of a bustling city, surrounded by the hum of life. Streets are crowded, businesses thrive, and the energy of humanity is palpable. It's a testament to the power of growth, the expansion of populations fueling economies, innovation, and progress. Yet, as you look closer, the cracks begin to show. Overcrowded hospitals, depleted resources, polluted air, and rising tensions over food and water. The question looms: how do we balance the benefits of population growth with its impact on a finite planet? This is the population growth paradox, where the very force that drives economic and social development also threatens the systems that sustain it. A growing population means more workers, more consumers, and more creativity. A dynamic engine for progress, but it also means greater demands on resources, more waste, and increased strain on infrastructure and ecosystems. How do you reconcile the promise of growth with the reality of its consequences? The paradox starts with the economic argument. A growing population stimulates demand, creates jobs, and spurs innovation. Younger generations sustain the workforce, support aging populations, and drive technological advancements. In many countries, especially those with declining birth rates, fears of stagnation loom without the steady infusion of new workers and consumers. Growth, it seems, is essential for economic vitality. But then, the environmental cost comes into focus. Every additional person adds to the demand for food, water, energy, and land. Forests are cleared for agriculture, fossil fuels are burned to power expanding cities, and oceans are overfished to feed growing appetites. The result? Climate change, biodiversity loss, and a planet pushed to its limits. How can a system built on infinite growth survive on a finite Earth? The paradox sharpens when you consider global inequalities. Population growth is highest in developing countries, where resources are often scarce and infrastructure struggles to keep pace. Meanwhile, wealthier nations with slower growth consume disproportionate amounts of the world's resources. This imbalance raises uncomfortable questions. Who should bear the burden of sustainability? Should countries with higher consumption reduce their footprint? Or should those with higher growth slow their expansion? Then there's the social dimension. A growing population brings diversity, energy, and cultural vibrancy. But it also raises challenges of integration, inequality, and competition for resources. Overcrowded cities strain housing, transportation, and healthcare systems. Food and water insecurity spark conflicts, and environmental degradation exacerbates vulnerabilities, disproportionately affecting those already at the margins. Philosophers and economists have long debated the paradox. Thomas Malthus famously warned that unchecked population growth would outpace food production, leading to famine and collapse. Yet, humanity has repeatedly defied his predictions through innovation, developing new technologies to produce more food, harness energy more efficiently, and expand economies. But these solutions often come with their own costs, from environmental degradation to social inequality. On the other side of the debate are those who see population growth as a solution rather than a problem. They argue that more people mean more ideas, more innovation, and greater capacity to solve the challenges we face. Humanity, they say, has always risen to the occasion, finding ways to adapt and thrive. But even this optimism doesn't erase the reality that resources like clean water, arable land, and fossil fuels are finite. The population growth paradox also forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of progress. Growth, for all its benefits, often comes at a cost, one that isn't evenly distributed. The rich consume more, the poor bear the brunt of environmental degradation, and future generations inherit the problems we create today. How do you ensure that the benefits of growth are shared equitably without sacrificing the planet's future? So, where does this leave you? Perhaps with the realization that the paradox isn't about choosing between growth and sustainability. It's about finding a way to balance them. It challenges you to think beyond short-term gains, to consider not just what growth offers, but what it demands. In the end, the population growth paradox isn't just about numbers, it's about values. It's about rethinking what progress means, not as a race to consume more, but as a commitment to live better. It's about investing in education, healthcare, and infrastructure to ensure that growth enhances quality of life, not just quantity. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: growth is not inherently good or bad. It's a tool, a force, a choice. The challenge is to wield it wisely, to ensure that the lives we add to this world are not just numbers in a ledger, but individuals who can thrive on a planet that continues to sustain us all. Because in the end, the measure of growth isn't how much we expand, it's how well we balance the needs of today with the promise of tomorrow. The paradox of meritocracy. You find yourself in a world that claims to reward hard work, talent, and determination. The promise of meritocracy is alluring. Anyone, regardless of where they start in life, can rise to the top if they have the drive and skill to succeed. It's a vision of fairness, a world where effort determines outcomes. But then you pause and look closer. The playing field isn't level. Some start the race miles ahead, with access to resources, education, and networks that others can only dream of. The question surfaces, sharp and unsettling. Can true equality of opportunity ever exist? This is the paradox of meritocracy, a system that promises fairness but often reinforces inequality. Meritocracy is built on the idea that success is earned, that your achievements are a reflection of your abilities and hard work. But in practice, it's impossible to separate merit from the circumstances that shape it. Privilege, luck, and systemic biases all influence who gets ahead, leaving the ideal of a fair system tantalizing but ultimately elusive. The paradox begins with the concept of opportunity. A true meritocracy requires equal starting points, access to quality education, healthcare, and opportunities for growth. But in reality, these starting points are anything but equal. A child born into wealth has access to better schools, extracurricular activities, and social connections. Meanwhile, a child born into poverty faces barriers at every turn, from underfunded schools to food insecurity. How can effort alone overcome such a disparity? The paradox deepens when you consider how success is rewarded. Those who achieve high status in a meritocracy are often celebrated as self-made, as though their accomplishments are purely the result of their own efforts. But this narrative overlooks the invisible scaffolding that supports them: family wealth, inherited privilege, or simply being in the right place at the right time. The system creates a cycle where success begets more success, while those at the bottom are blamed for not trying hard enough, even when the odds are stacked against them. Meritocracy also has a psychological dimension. It instills a belief that the system is fair, even when it isn't. Those who succeed feel validated, their achievements seen as proof of their worth, but those who struggle are left questioning their value, internalizing failure as a personal flaw rather than a reflection of systemic barriers. This creates a toxic dynamic where inequality is justified in the name of merit, even as it grows deeper. And yet, despite its flaws, meritocracy remains an appealing ideal. It's a system that promises hope and mobility, a break from rigid hierarchies of birth and privilege. In many ways, it's a vast improvement over aristocracies or caste systems where your fate is determined entirely by who you are, not what you can do. The paradox lies in the tension between what meritocracy aspires to be and the realities of human society. Philosophers and sociologists have long wrestled with this dilemma. John Rawls, for example, argued that true fairness requires addressing inequalities at their root, redistributing resources to ensure that everyone has a genuine chance to succeed. Others, like Michael Young, who coined the term meritocracy in his satirical book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, warned of its darker side, a system where those at the top feel entitled to their position and those at the bottom are dismissed as undeserving. The paradox also raises questions about what we value as a society. Meritocracy assumes that certain traits, intelligence, ambition, creativity, are the most important markers of worth. But what about kindness, empathy, or resilience? Are these less valuable simply because they're harder to measure or monetize? By privileging some forms of merit over others, the system narrows our definition of success and leaves many contributions unrecognized. So, where does this leave you? Perhaps with the realization that the paradox of meritocracy isn't about rejecting the ideal, it's about confronting its flaws. It challenges you to think critically about what fairness really means and to acknowledge that true equality of opportunity requires more than slogans or promises. It requires action, investing in education, addressing systemic biases, and redistributing resources to ensure that everyone has a chance to reach their potential. In the end, the paradox of meritocracy doesn't diminish its value, it deepens it. It reminds you that fairness isn't a given. It's a goal, one that requires constant effort and vigilance. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: success isn't just about climbing the ladder. It's about ensuring that the ladder is sturdy, accessible, and within reach for everyone. Because in a true meritocracy, the measure of a society isn't just who rises to the top. It's how many are empowered to rise at all. The paradox of identity. You look in the mirror, searching for the answer to a question that feels both simple and impossibly complex. Who am I? The reflection shows a face, but behind it lies a tangle of thoughts, feelings, memories, and dreams. You feel like you know yourself, but then the world steps in, layering its expectations and judgments over your sense of self. The question sharpens. Are you defined by who you believe you are, or by how society sees you? This is the paradox of identity, a tension between the internal and the external, between personal truth and societal perception. On one side, identity feels deeply personal, your essence shaped by your experiences, values, and choices. But on the other, identity is a social construct, defined and redefined by the world around you. The conflict arises when these two forces collide, forcing you to navigate the space between self-expression and societal expectation. The paradox begins with how identity forms. From an early age, you're told who you are, or who you should be. Family, culture, religion, and community all play a role in shaping your sense of self. Yet, as you grow, you start to question these influences, peeling back the layers to uncover your own truth. But just as you begin to define yourself, the world pushes back. Labels are assigned, assumptions are made, and you realize that how others see you can feel as real and as limiting as how you see yourself. Consider the way society imposes categories: race, gender, class, sexuality. These labels can offer connection and belonging, but they can also feel restrictive, boxing you into roles that don't reflect your full reality. A person might identify as non-binary, but face constant pressure to conform to traditional gender norms. Another might see themselves as more than their socioeconomic background, but struggle against stereotypes tied to their upbringing. The paradox becomes even sharper when identity intersects with power. Some identities are privileged, treated as the default, while others are marginalized, seen as other. For those whose identities are devalued, the clash between self-perception and societal perception can be a daily struggle. How do you stay true to yourself when the world tells you you're not enough or too much? And then there's the question of authenticity. In a world that demands both conformity and individuality, how do you reconcile the two? Social media amplifies this tension, encouraging self-expression while simultaneously inviting judgment. You might curate your online persona to reflect your best self, only to wonder if the version of you that others see is real. Philosophers and psychologists have long wrestled with this paradox. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre argue that identity is a choice, something you create through your actions. But sociologists like Erving Goffman emphasize the performative nature of identity, suggesting that much of who we are is shaped by the roles we play in society. Both perspectives ring true, and yet they highlight the tension between the freedom to define yourself and the constraints of the world around you. The paradox of identity also raises questions about connection. Who are you when you're alone? And who are you in the presence of others? Relationships often challenge your sense of self, reflecting both your truest and most malleable aspects. You might find joy in shared identity, but also feel the pull to compromise or conceal parts of yourself to fit in. And yet, Despite its conflicts, identity remains one of the most powerful forces in human life. It shapes how you see the world, how you navigate challenges, and how you connect with others. The paradox doesn't weaken its importance, it deepens it, revealing identity as a dynamic process, constantly evolving as you interact with the world. So, where does this leave you? Perhaps with the understanding that the paradox of identity isn't about choosing between who you are and how you're seen. It's about finding balance. It challenges you to own your truth while remaining open to growth, to navigate the tension between self and society without losing sight of either. In the end, the paradox of identity isn't a problem to be solved. It's a journey to be embraced. It reminds you that identity is both personal and collective, fluid yet rooted. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: you are not just a reflection of the world's expectations, nor are you a fixed essence that exists in isolation. You are both, and in that complexity lies the beauty of being human, the paradox of privacy. You unlock your phone, scroll through an app, and click Accept without a second thought. Somewhere in that long wall of terms and conditions you didn't read, you've just handed over a piece of yourself, your location, preferences, or maybe even your voice. It feels harmless, a small trade for convenience, but then you pause. You value your privacy, you'd say it's a right, not a luxury. And yet, with every click, every share, every search, you give it away. The question looms, unsettling and unavoidable. How much control do you really have over your own data? This is the paradox of privacy, where the desire for personal control collides with the reality of convenience. On one hand, we demand privacy as a fundamental right, a shield against surveillance, exploitation, and manipulation. But on the other, we willingly trade our most intimate details, what we buy, who we talk to, where we go, for the promise of faster services, personalized experiences, and free apps. It's a contradiction embedded in modern life, one that reveals the tension between our values and our habits. The paradox begins with the way technology has reshaped privacy. In the digital age, privacy isn't just about closing the blinds or locking your diary. It's about data. Every action you take online leaves a trace, a breadcrumb in the vast, invisible network of information that powers the modern world. Companies use this data to refine algorithms, tailor ads, and predict behavior. Governments use it for surveillance, security, and control. And all of it, every byte, originates from you. Consider how often you share your data without even realizing it. A fitness app tracks your steps, a shopping site logs your preferences, a social media platform records your interactions. It feels innocuous, even helpful, until you remember that these platforms don't exist in a vacuum. Your data isn't just sitting there. It's being analyzed, sold, and used to influence everything from the ads you see to the news you consume. The paradox sharpens when you think about consent. In theory, you have control over your data. You can choose what to share, opt out of tracking, and read those lengthy privacy policies. But in practice, the choices are often illusory. Opting out means losing access to services you rely on. Privacy settings are buried under layers of complexity. And even if you manage to protect your data, it's still vulnerable to breaches, hacks, and misuse by third parties. Then there's the question of convenience, the tools that make life easier. Navigation apps, smart assistants, one-click purchases are built on data. The more you share, the more seamless the experience becomes. It's tempting to prioritize the immediate benefits over the abstract risks. But every time you trade privacy for convenience, you widen the gap between what you value and what you practice. Philosophers and ethicists have long debated the tension between privacy and progress. Some argue that privacy is a relic of the past, incompatible with the transparency and connectivity of the digital age. Others see it as a cornerstone of freedom, a safeguard against coercion and control. Both perspectives highlight the central question: what is privacy worth to you? The paradox also forces you to confront deeper questions about trust. Who owns your data? Can you trust companies, governments, or even individuals to use it responsibly? Data scandals, from surveillance programs to high-profile breaches, have eroded that trust, revealing how easily privacy can be compromised in pursuit of profit or power. And yet, despite the risks, the paradox persists. We demand privacy while fueling the very systems that undermine it. We decry surveillance while accepting cookies. We fear losing control over our data while freely uploading our lives to the cloud. So, where does this leave you? Perhaps with the realization that the paradox of privacy isn't about rejecting technology, it's about using it wisely. It challenges you to think critically about the trade-offs you make, to demand greater transparency from those who collect your data, and to advocate for policies that protect individual rights in a world driven by information. In the end, the paradox of privacy isn't just about data. It's about agency. It reminds you that privacy is both a right and a responsibility, something that must be actively defended in a landscape designed to erode it. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: privacy isn't about disappearing. It's about deciding what parts of yourself you're willing to share and on whose terms. Because in the digital age, the question isn't just who's watching. It's whether you still have the power to choose. The paradox of globalization. You pick up your phone, a device designed in California, assembled in China, and shipped to your doorstep via a sprawling global network. The coffee you're drinking is sourced from Colombia, roasted in Italy, and branded by a multinational corporation. The world feels smaller, more connected, like a tightly woven web of trade, ideas, and collaboration. Yet, as the connections grow stronger economically, you see the fractures emerge culturally and politically. The question rises like a fault line beneath the surface. Can a global community truly coexist with national sovereignty? This is the paradox of globalization, where the forces that unite the world also pull it apart. On one hand, globalization promises progress, a seamless exchange of goods, services, and ideas that lifts economies, fosters innovation, and bridges divides. On the other, it stirs tensions, eroding cultural identities, deepening inequalities, and fueling political backlash. It's a contradiction that sits at the heart of modern life, revealing the complexity of living in a world that's simultaneously interconnected and divided. The paradox begins with economics. Globalization has revolutionized trade, creating unprecedented opportunities for wealth and development. Corporations operate across borders, supply chains span continents, and markets are no longer constrained by geography. For consumers, it means greater choice and lower prices. For businesses, it means access to global talent and resources. But this economic integration comes with costs. Jobs in one country are outsourced to another, fueling unemployment and resentment. Small local businesses struggle to compete with multinational giants, wealth concentrates in the hands of a few, while entire communities feel left behind. Then there's the cultural dimension. Globalization spreads ideas, art, and traditions, creating a rich tapestry of cultural exchange, but it also sparks fears of homogenization, where dominant cultures overshadow smaller ones. A fast food chain might open in a remote village, symbolizing progress to some but cultural erosion to others. Language, cuisine, and traditions can become commodities, stripped of their depth and meaning in the rush to make them marketable. The same forces that bring cultures together can also dilute their uniqueness. The political side of the paradox is just as stark. Globalization requires cooperation on a massive scale, agreements on trade, climate, security, and more. But as nations integrate economically, they often feel their sovereignty slipping away. Decisions made in international institutions can override national policies, creating a sense of powerlessness among citizens. This tension fuels nationalism and protectionism, movements that seek to reclaim control even at the cost of global progress. Consider the rise of populist leaders and movements in recent years. Many have gained traction by rejecting the promises of globalization, framing it as a force that undermines national interests. America First, Brexit, and similar slogans tap into a widespread feeling that globalization benefits the elite while ignoring the needs of ordinary people. The more the world comes together economically, the more fragmented it becomes politically. And yet, despite these tensions, globalization endures. It has transformed industries, lifted millions out of poverty, and connected the farthest corners of the earth. It's hard to imagine a world without it, a world where knowledge, goods, and opportunities are confined by borders. The paradox lies in the fact that while globalization creates immense opportunities, it also demands trade-offs that aren't evenly distributed. Philosophers and economists have long debated this tension. Some argue that globalization is inevitable, a natural progression of human development. Others warn that its unchecked growth risks deepening divides and destabilizing societies. Both perspectives highlight the same challenge. How do you balance the benefits of integration with the need for autonomy, identity, and fairness? The paradox of globalization also raises questions about the future. Can a global community address shared challenges, climate change, pandemics, economic inequality, without sacrificing the diversity and sovereignty that make nations unique? How do you create systems that promote fairness and cooperation while respecting the differences that define us? So where does this leave you? Perhaps with the understanding that the paradox of globalization isn't about choosing between global integration and national sovereignty. It's about navigating the space where they overlap. It challenges you to think critically about the kind of world you want to live in, one that balances connection with autonomy, progress with preservation, and unity with diversity. In the end, the paradox of globalization isn't just about trade deals or cultural exchange. It's about humanity's ability to coexist in a world that grows smaller and larger at the same time. It reminds you that the future isn't about erasing borders, but about rethinking how they define us, less as barriers and more as bridges. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: globalization is not just an economic or political force, it's a human one. It reflects our shared desire to connect, to grow, to learn from one another. The challenge is to harness that desire in a way that respects the complexity of our world, ensuring that the connections we build don't come at the cost of what makes us who we are. The paradox of justice. You're standing in a courtroom, a place where the scales of justice are meant to balance perfectly. The ideal is clear: fairness for all, blind to race, wealth, or status. But then you notice the complexity. A wealthy defendant walks away with a fine, while a poorer one faces prison for the same offense. A program gives extra support to historically marginalized groups, sparking debates about fairness. The question rises, weighty and unavoidable: how can justice be both fair and unequal? This is the paradox of justice, where the pursuit of fairness often demands unequal treatment. At its core lies the tension between equality and equity, between treating everyone the same and addressing the unique challenges that make the same profoundly unfair. Justice, it turns out, is not as simple as balancing scales. It's a dynamic process, fraught with contradictions and tough choices. Equality suggests that everyone should be treated identically, with the same rules, opportunities, and resources. It's a comforting ideal, rooted in the belief that fairness lies in uniformity. But equity takes a different approach, recognizing that people start from different places. To achieve true fairness, equity argues, you have to account for those differences, giving more to those who need more. This distinction is where the paradox emerges. How can unequal treatment be fair? Consider affirmative action. Its goal is to level the playing field by addressing historical disadvantages faced by marginalized groups. For some, it's a necessary step toward justice, a way to correct systemic inequalities. For others, it feels like reverse discrimination, where fairness is sacrificed for favoritism. Both perspectives stem from a desire for justice, yet they clash over what fairness really means. The paradox also plays out in criminal justice. A wealthy individual who commits a minor offense might be fined, while someone living in poverty might face jail time for the same crime because they can't afford the fine. Is it fair to treat them identically when their circumstances are so different? Or consider restorative justice, which prioritizes repairing harm and understanding over punishment. To some, it's a humane approach that addresses the root causes of crime. To others, it seems like leniency that undermines accountability. And then there's the broader societal context. Justice isn't just about individuals, it's about systems. Generational poverty, systemic racism, and unequal access to education and healthcare all create disparities that a purely equal approach fails to address. Equity seeks to dismantle these barriers, but doing so often requires redistributing resources, power, and opportunities in ways that can feel deeply unequal. The paradox deepens when you consider human psychology. People are quick to notice perceived unfairness, especially when they feel they've been disadvantaged. A policy designed to address inequality can spark resentment in those who see it as favoritism, even if they've benefited from unacknowledged privileges their entire lives. This tension complicates the pursuit of justice, turning it into a battleground of competing perspectives. Philosophers and ethicists have long grappled with the paradox of justice. John Rawls, in his theory of justice, argued for the difference principle, which permits inequalities only if they benefit the least advantaged. In contrast, others like Robert Nozick championed individual rights, arguing that redistributive policies violate personal liberty. Both views illuminate the core dilemma. Justice demands both fairness and freedom, but these ideals often pull in opposite directions. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of fairness itself. Is fairness about outcomes, ensuring that everyone ends up in the same place, or is it about opportunities, ensuring that everyone starts with the same chances? And what happens when perfect fairness is impossible, when no solution feels entirely just? So, where does this leave you? Perhaps with the realization that justice is not a fixed destination, but an ongoing process, one that requires balancing competing values and navigating complex trade-offs. It challenged you to think critically about what fairness means in practice, not just in theory. In the end, the paradox of justice reminds you that equality and equity are not enemies. They're partners in the pursuit of a fairer world. It's about recognizing that treating everyone the same doesn't always lead to fairness, and that true justice sometimes requires acknowledging and addressing the differences that divide us. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: justice isn't about perfection. It's about progress. It's about striving to create systems that honor both individuality and community, that balance the needs of the many with the dignity of the few. Because, in the end, justice isn't just a principle, it's a commitment to understanding, empathy, and the constant imperfect work of making the world a little fairer for everyone. The paradox of reparations. You stand at the crossroads of history and the present, where the weight of past wrongs presses against the demands of the future. Behind you, the injustices are undeniable: land stolen, labor exploited, freedoms denied. Ahead of you lies a question that sparks fierce debate. Should the descendants of those who benefited from these injustices bear the cost of setting things right? Advocates call it justice, a necessary act of repair. Critics see it as an unfair burden, punishing people for sins they didn't commit. The question looms, complex and divisive. Can reparations ever truly reconcile the past without fracturing the present? This is the paradox of reparations, a dilemma rooted in morality, history, and practicality. At its core is a tension between accountability and fairness. On one hand, reparations seek to address the lasting harm caused by slavery, colonization, and systemic oppression, harms that continue to shape the lives of millions today. On the other hand, they ask people who may have played no direct role in these injustices to shoulder the responsibility of repair. How do you balance justice for the wronged with fairness for those tasked with making amends? The paradox begins with the lingering effects of historical injustices. Slavery, for example, didn't just end with abolition. It left legacies of poverty, systemic racism, and generational trauma. Colonization stripped resources from nations, leaving them economically disadvantaged long after independence. These scars don't vanish with time. They're passed down, manifesting in inequalities that persist today. Advocates argue that reparations are about more than money. They're about acknowledging this enduring harm and taking steps to repair it. But then comes the counterargument. Why should today's generations pay for the actions of their ancestors? Many people alive today had no direct involvement in these historical wrongs. They may feel disconnected from the past, believing they shouldn't be held accountable for something they didn't personally do. This sentiment becomes even more complicated in multicultural societies, where not everyone shares the same ancestral ties to the injustices in question. The paradox also raises questions about practicality. What would reparations look like? Monetary payments to descendants of enslaved or colonized peoples, investments in education, healthcare, and infrastructure for marginalized communities, symbolic acts of apology or restitution. Each approach has its own challenges. from determining who qualifies to addressing the sheer scale of what's owed. And even if reparations are implemented, can they ever truly repair the harm done? Or are they merely a gesture, insufficient to heal wounds that run so deep? Then there's the issue of resentment. Reparations, no matter how well-intentioned, risk creating new divisions. Critics argue that they could foster bitterness among those who feel they're being unfairly burdened or excluded. At the same time, a lack of reparations perpetuates resentment among those who continue to suffer from historical injustices. The paradox lies in the fact that both action and inaction carry the risk of further conflict. Philosophers and political theorists have long grappled with the paradox of reparations. Some, like John Locke, emphasize the moral obligation to restore what was unjustly taken. Others, like Friedrich Nietzsche, warn against the dangers of defining the present solely through the lens of past grievances. Both perspectives reveal the central tension. Reparations are about justice, but they must navigate the complex terrain of human emotion, memory, and fairness. The paradox also forces you to confront broader questions about responsibility. Are reparations about blame, or are they about repair? Critics often frame them as punishment, but advocates see them as an act of accountability, not for individual guilt, but for collective responsibility. It's not about making people feel ashamed of the past. It's about ensuring that the benefits some inherited are used to address the harms others inherited. So, where does this leave you? Perhaps with the realization that the paradox of reparations isn't about choosing between justice and fairness, it's about finding a way to honor both. It challenges you to look beyond simplistic narratives of guilt and innocence, to see reparations not as a punishment, but as an opportunity for reconciliation. In the end, the paradox of reparations reminds you that justice is rarely straightforward. It's about acknowledging the past without being trapped by it, about repairing harm without creating new wounds. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: reparations are not just about righting wrongs. They're about building a future where the legacies of injustice no longer define who gets to thrive and who is left behind. Because in the end, reparations aren't just about the past. They're about what kind of society you want to create today, and whether you're willing to confront the uncomfortable truths that lie at the heart of justice.